I started working on Jenufa probably more than 25 years ago, something like that, when I was working for Universal Edition in London, and John Tyrrell, the world's leading Janacek expert, and Charles Mackairis were preparing an edition of Jenufa, and I assisted in the preparation of the edition. And it was then that I saw how complex the manuscript materials for the work were, and we already knew that there were several versions of the opera. It had gone through a series of revisions, and we began to see that the earliest versions of the opera were in many cases recoverable. And so once I'd moved on from working on the 1908 Brunner version for Mackairis and Tyrrell, I decided that it would be worth trying to piece together the version of the opera that was performed at the premiere in Brunner in 1904. From the first version, there are many accounts, reminiscences and reviews and critical reviews from the premiere, and these are all well known, and they raised issues of Janacek's use of folk idioms and also of speech melody, which is a big topic in the Janacek literature. But no one knew exactly how the work sounded at the premiere. However, there were several manuscripts that preserved a lot of the music from the premiere, and these were a manuscript full score, a manuscript vocal score, both of which were copied for Janacek by one of his copyists, and also the original orchestral parts. And these contained the music from the first version. In many cases, they were heavily altered to correspond to later versions, so there was lots of manuscript pasting over or corrections, scratching out and rewriting, but still the early version was there at the bottom. There are not really any major differences to the story. The biggest difference in that respect is that the 1904 version contains the Kostelnichka's Act 1 aria, Ah, He Had Golden Hair, which is where she reflects on her own troubled marriage and her own difficult married life. This, however, had already been restored to later versions of the opera by Johannes Martin Dürr in his edition for Universal Edition in 1969, and it was also retained by Charles Mackairis and John Tyrrell in their edition. However, we now know for certain that this aria was cut by Janacek probably by 1906, but it was certainly performed in the first run of performances in 1904 and 1905, so it belongs to the 1904 version. The other differences are more to do with the musical aspect of the score, but they are very wide-ranging. Janacek's revisions to the opera were very thorough, and they affected the whole work from the first note to the last, quite literally in fact, because the opening xylophone solo, which depicts the turning of the mill wheel, was originally notated slightly differently. The rhythms were different. And right up to the end of the opera, Janacek cut the last two bars. So his changes, his revisions, really did affect the opera as a whole. I'd say that there are probably three main aspects to the revision and the differences between the 1904 version and later versions. Firstly, the orchestration and the textures, they tend to be more in the spirit of late 19th century, so the textures are somewhat fuller, thicker, and the harmony, also the harmonic language, is more redolent of late 19th century. So the textual and harmonic changes that Janacek made in his revisions were very thorough. And also the vocal lines are often quite different. In the case of Latza, the demanding tenor part, it was even more demanding in the first version. Often very high lines, no preparation for high notes, just coming in straight on them. And I think that because the tenor in the original performances changed, this may have motivated some of the changes. However, another major factor in Janacek's later revisions was that he was trying to incorporate his theories on a naturalistic setting of prose in operatic music, so that the differences we can detect between 1904 and the later versions really show a lot of how Janacek developed this feeling for the voice. To a certain extent, even in 1904 the opera is relatively through composed, but there are aspects of number opera. For instance, the big ensemble in Act 1, where the chorus and the soloists sing Każdy pareximusi. This was much longer in the original version, and also the music that came before it, so that it's much more evidently in the tradition of the Italian pezzo concertato. So it goes from a fast section to a central slow section, and then a very slow final section, which is developed rather more extravagantly in 1904. But there are no real set pieces as such, but there are many more extended solos than there were in the later revision. Not directly, not in so many words. What we do know is that when the conductor in Prague, Karel Kovačevič, made some further revisions to the work, and some years after these had become standard in performances, Janacek was a bit annoyed that some of the royalties were still going to Kovačevič's widow, and he said that Jenufa was performed perfectly well before Kovačevič's revisions, and this he obviously traced this back to 1904. So the implication of this statement is that he was in many ways satisfied with the initial version. At least he felt that the work's history from 1904 onwards was a valid one, and that his compositional competence was there from the beginning. And that's something I'd agree with. Even in this early version, there are so many passages that are recognizably Janacek. Not really. It's true that the orchestra in the Brno performances was really tiny, so there were very few string players. But the score itself still demands the same number of woodwind, brass, percussion, and in theory strings. So it could be played by a larger orchestra. However, the fact that the orchestra, the first performances, was small probably helped, because, as I said earlier, the orchestration was originally somewhat thicker, so having a smaller orchestra for the 1904 version certainly helps. Since I've been making this reconstruction, there have been, before Rennes, there have been 3 earlier performances or productions. The first one was in Nottingham, a concert performance of Act 2, and this helped me enormously in hearing what the problems were with the score and some of the problems I had with reconstructing it. This was only a concert performance. The first production of the 1904 version in modern times was in Warsaw in 2004, and this was in a tiny theatre. It was actually a lot smaller than the original Brno production in 1904. It worked very well on an intimate scale, but the edition was in its initial phases. One irons out certain problems as one goes along. There were 4 performances in Warsaw, and then in 2008 there was a production in Brno by the Janacek Academy, conducted by Mark Audus, who is conducting this performance here in Rennes. This was also an excellent production, an excellent student production, and again I was able to make certain refinements and to think about certain problems. The state of the edition now means that the performances in Rennes are really the first really complete professional account of the 1904 version. And the first performances in this state of the opera since 1905, probably. Janacek didn't make his changes overnight. For the first year of performances, and there were several in Brno and in other provincial Czech towns, it was essentially the text that we're going to hear in Rennes. So this version has a validity of its own, and the fact that it's being performed here in Rennes, between the town of Brno, is very, very appropriate and very satisfying. I'm sure that Janacek would be thrilled. It's a lovely theatre, and it looks like it's going to be a very, very interesting production.